relatives doing? There was a study of working class and lower middle class widows in Manchester by a British folklorist. I forget the details of how she got her sample, but they were women who had all had contacts with their husbands who had died already. And so she sat down with them and interviewed them about what their husbands came to tell them about. And this is very interesting. One woman said, I guess in Britain they have an income tax like we do. She said, he always did the taxes, and I never paid attention. Now I suddenly had to do it. And I was struggling with the taxes, and I was in tears. And I heard his voice. And he said, don't look around. Just listen to what I have to say. In box 4A on page 3, write 435 pounds. On box 6C on page 2, write 225 pounds. Subtract this from, just all this stuff. She said, so she did. Followed his instructions from the grave. She filled them in. She sent in her income tax form. And she got a refund from the government. Such a deal. I was having breakfast with a woman once in London, and we were talking about these things, and I'm afraid I failed as an anthropologist. We were talking about this subject over breakfast. I'm having tea and scone. I'm British. It's actually pretty good. I learned to drink tea with milk, and I'll tell you it's really good. This was a conference on end-of-life issues, I should say, too. This woman says, we were talking about people coming back from the dead, and this woman says to me, a very attractive woman, I must say, a woman in her 40s, quite attractive. She says, my husband comes back to see me. He's been dead a year or two, regularly. I said, oh, yes. She says, we have spiritual sex. Would you like to know about spiritual sex? No. I looked at my eggs and said, no, you can tell me another time. What a fool I was. She assured me that it was very good. And that made me feel a whole lot better. I have to say that. So if you can have spiritual sex over here, whatever. But there's no question about it that people report sightings of the dead or a sensation that the dead is near. Those are not uncommon at all. And it is also common, at least in our own culture, that when people are at the point that they're just about to check out of this world, and I've read this and I've also had people tell me this frequently, that the dead, those who are dying in their last minutes, really, see the presence of someone who predeceased them in the room with telling them, it's okay, I'm waiting for it. Come with me. And I've heard that a number of times from people. Now, is this happening, or is this our brains so addled we're doing the best we can? I will tell you, I have no idea. But I do take it as a cultural datum. People report these experiences, they believe them, and as an anthropologist, I'll say, okay, I accept that on face value. But I'm not going to go looking for some psychological explanation or brain physiology explanation. I just work at the level of culture. And if people report it, perhaps they report it because they expect it, because they've heard it from others. I really don't know. But I think that's a possibility. But whatever, we take it as the data. And incidentally, there are a fair number of people in this society now who say they've had a near-death experience. And I I spent a year hanging around just on my own time with those people here in Seattle. They have an organization. They meet once a month. And they get together and talk about their near-death experience. And they all say they've made this journey. They've seen the other side. They know what's there. But they come back to tell about it. And I was in a presentation once where a woman who's well known for her near-death experiences was talking about how she died. She was having a hysterectomy. She died on the surgical table. And she rose above her body and she went to the afterlife and she confronted Jesus. And she gave to the audience a fairly detailed description of what he looked like, which was, I have to say, it reminded me of my 5th grade, Jesus in my 5th grade Sunday school readers when I was forced to go to Sunday school as a kid. He looked very familiar to those kinds of images. Jesus vaguely looking like a Swede. Right. Anyway, so I'm a little skeptical. This was her description. When she started talking about her discussion with Jesus, people in the audience, tears were going down their cheeks. How many of you have ever talked to someone who's talked to Jesus? I don't see any hands going. Well, I haven't either, so these kinds of things are reported, they're experienced, and so they become part of the cultural. I think what Harris was thinking about, things are more enchanted than we think they are. This isn't just a rational world. There's a lot of enchantment that goes on, these kinds of things. Now, we can get rid of this for the time being. Now, we need to think about what we're going to do about this corpse, because corpses. Incidentally, what's my time on this?
I think as long as you want, I think that people here are pretty interested in.
Okay, I'll go for 15 or 20 more minutes and we can stop. So, because I have to say, I run off at the mouth on this subject. My friends, I don't talk about it among my friends because they heard it all. Enough, Green, just boring. If we've got a corpse in our hands, we need to do something appropriate with it. That's part of the enchantment. The earliest Christians buried their bodies in Roman catacombs to keep them out of sight from the pagan Romans, because these were persecuted people to begin with. They didn't need more trouble. They did not want their graves desecrated. Once Christianity became the state religion of Rome, which I think was 313 or something like that, Constantine, the graves all went above the catacombs and people were buried in cemeteries around. Now, an interesting phenomenon occurred which still is practiced to some degree. There were people who arose who were thought to be saintly, and we're starting to get the idea of sainthood going on here. And so saintly people were buried usually with markers better than everybody else. The saints apparently radiated a kind of charisma. The closer you could be buried to one of the saints, the better for you and the fate of your soul. And so there was competition on, particularly among the elites of this new Christian community, to have your body buried as closely to the most saintly people as you possibly can, because you could share in their charisma. There is a very interesting secular manifestations of the same phenomenon in London's Highgate Cemetery. There is a very large monument to Karl Marx, because he's buried there, with his bust with Marx on top. It's pretty ugly. It's not a good representation of him, really, but it's big. Crowded, just jammed